So today I wanted to talk just a little bit about self-compassion and what it means and how it can be useful in working with things we might struggle with, like anger or any sort of tendency we might have that doesn't fit with the sort of person we want to be. Um, Sometimes I hear people say, well, you can't love other people unless you love yourself first. I've even heard people say you can't have compassion for other people unless you have compassion for yourself first. And I've found those not to be true. Maybe it's because I'm a psychologist, but I know a lot of people who um, seem to very naturally have compassion for others, or maybe not naturally, seem to be very good at it anyway. They're very good at caring for others, and when they see others struggling or suffering, they want to help. And yet, they have great difficulty directing that kindness toward themselves when they see themselves struggling or suffering and having a hard time. And in many cases, I've talked with some of you before about my own struggles with anger, and this mirrors my experience. In many cases, when folks struggle with things, and particularly when they're behaving in ways that don't reflect their values or fit with the kind of person they want to be, there are lots of things we can do when we do that that really, in some ways, help us avoid the discomfort that comes up when we see that. And so, for example, with anger, it can be very easily, if that anger is triggered by another person, to shift into patterns of blaming. I only did that because you did this. Or, we can rationalize. It makes sense, right? I have the right to feel angry about this, right? Or we distract ourselves and just not think about it, pay attention to other things, turn on the television, surf the internet, whatever. Or if we allow ourselves to come into contact with the pain we've caused or with the hurt that we've caused, we can go into another avoidance strategy that is actually a little sneakier, because it feels like maybe we're doing something about it even when we're not. And that's self-attacking, shaming, and self-criticizing, saying, I'm bad because I did that. And the problem with that, if I say, I did that and I feel bad, that generally doesn't inspire doing something better. That doesn't inspire thinking what would be helpful. And actually, if you think about it, if I'm very convinced that I'm bad, well, that's a pretty hopeless place to be in. Self-compassion isn't about letting yourself off the hook or not being responsible for your own actions. It's actually organized around finding a way to help yourself do better, to create the causes and conditions that are likely to help us do better in confronting suffering in our own lives and others, and in particularly in working with the things that are very difficult for us. So, for example, if when we see our own anger, or we see the impacts of our anger affecting others in ways that are hurtful, if instead of blaming them or rationalizing or avoiding or even attacking ourselves, what if we just allowed ourselves to compassionately look both at the suffering and the pain that we caused, but also to acknowledge that this hurts me, to notice that I've hurt the people I care about, and I don't want to do that anymore. I want to help create the causes and conditions in my life so that I can do better. And to not make any special exceptions for ourselves, but maybe to just try and support ourselves in the way that we would try and help anyone that we deeply cared about who came to us and said, I'm really struggling with this anger, and I don't want to be like this anymore. I want to do better. And to think what would be helpful, right? That's really, I think, if we were to simplify it down really, really basically, a lot of what compassion is, being willing to see suffering, allow ourselves to be moved by it, and then to really kind of dig down in the question of, given this, what would be helpful?
Commit misdeeds, then there's this thing of, oh, I went beyond the, how I want to be as a person. My own ethical values, the precepts I took voluntarily, my, negative mental state made me act in ways that went beyond what I feel good about doing and the kind of person I want to be. And so to clear that up, we have 4 opponent powers. Yeah, so regret and a determination not to do it again, taking refuge in bodhicitta, and then some kind of remedial action. And so I think that is that purification practice. Maybe you can call that self-compassion, because it's the thing of, what can I do to do better in the future? Well, first I have to clear up what I did, make a resolution about the future, and so on and so forth.
One of the things, as you were talking, there's this sense that I did that, and the behavior was linked with the emotion, with the anger, and how anger organizes the mind. And so even as you talked about it, that's where there was a lot of self-compassion in that. It was the refraining from saying, I'm bad that I did that. But when anger comes in my mind, I find my way behaving in ways that violates the precepts, that violates who I want to be. So I've got to find a way to work with that anger. And that's really, for me, what I see being so helpful about self-compassion, because it helps us keep from getting caught up in the self-attacking or the blaming or the negating. And it doesn't matter who we blame. When we're doing that, we're not saying, well, what would be helpful in me not doing this anymore? And I like the regret, this ability to look back and say, gosh, that's not okay with me that I did that. And it's a way of doing that in a way that doesn't distract. It doesn't focus me on how bad I am. Or even in the case of guilt, which I would see as much more useful than shame, but still can be very distracting because I get caught up in feeling all the guilt, and so I'm feeling that versus focusing on how do I do better? What do I do? So that was one of the things. And I think actually, I don't know if it was in An Open-Hearted Life or something, I'd written something about shame and guilt. No, it wasn't. It wasn't that. It was actually, I think it was Venerable Tarpa who I had talked with about this passage I was writing in the anger book where I was talking about this. And she said, in Buddhism, we talk much more about regret. And that's really helpful. And that was a deeply helpful instruction.